Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. While electric vehicles are becoming more than an occasional sighting on our roads, the federal government has spent more than $300 million in tax dollars, by the way, for its zero emissions vehicles subsidy program. Is this good value for taxpayers' money? Our guest has some views. Please welcome Jerome Gessaroli, who teaches at the BC Institute of Technology and is also a visiting fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Welcome to Boom and Bust.
Well, thank you for having me, Tony.
So I guess my first question is, can you describe for our viewers the various federal and provincial electric vehicle subsidies?
Sure. First of all, the federal government offers a subsidy of $5,000 for the purchase of certain fully electric vehicles. And some, but not all, the provinces also have their own incentives in place. So Quebec, for instance, would have a high of, well, it was $8,000, and I believe they just reduced it to $7,000 now. And Alberta, Ontario, Saskatchewan, they don't offer any provincial subsidies. And then there's also subsidies for charging stations.
Right, okay. And then Manitoba, I guess, from your list, would have a subsidy?
Manitoba has no subsidy.
Okay. So that's what's in place. Then we had the Liberal campaign from the last federal election, and now we've had the 2022 budget. Anything in those documents of interest to this file?
Well, yeah. They announced just recently that they are going to fund hundreds of millions of dollars more in charging station, the infrastructure development for the charging stations, and they are also going to be putting equivalent amount of money into the EV program for the upcoming year.
Okay, so this is not going away anytime soon, it sounds like.
No, and it's some significant dollars we're talking about also.
It sounds like it. So what's been the impact on electric vehicle ownership, as an example?
Well, it does. The subsidies will encourage sales of electric vehicles. The problem is twofold, is that the subsidies are not accessible to many Canadians. Because EVs are expensive, only upper income households tend to purchase them, and therefore they're the ones eligible for the incentive. That's problematic from a fairness point of view. And the second point is that they're very expensive for the amount of carbon that they actually reduce. So when you replace an electric vehicle, internal combustion engine vehicle with an electric vehicle, you'll save some emissions because there's no tailpipe emissions with the electric vehicle. But given the amount that the government puts in to incentivize people, it's a very expensive proposition.
Yeah, and I want to explore that a little bit further, because you are making the point that these government subsidies aren't, in effect, cost effective. So can you unpack that a little bit more for our audience?
Sure. Yeah, what we look at is that how much is an electric vehicle going to reduce carbon emissions? And we found that it's about 28 tons over 10 years.
Okay. So
28 tons of carbon be reduced if you can switch to one electric vehicle. And then we looked at, well, how much then are they putting into the programs to incent the purchase of these EVs? And I calculated it was about, for the federal program alone, it was about $355 it cost to reduce 1 ton of carbon emissions. Okay. Now, that in itself, we can't say whether that's good or bad. But what's important is, what does the federal government place on carbon emissions? In other words, what cost do they place on it? Now, the federal government puts a $50 cost per ton on carbon emissions. In other words, If every ton of carbon we release into the atmosphere, it costs the society about $50 in damages of some sort.
So
Okay.
hold that thought. We're going to take a commercial break. So $50 is what people have got to keep in mind while we go to break. We'll be right back after these messages. We're back here at Boom and Bust here with Jerome Gessaroli. Jerome, you were just talking about the $50 a ton, carbon pricing, I guess, with the federal government. So please continue with your explanation as to why government subsidies for electric vehicles is not cost effective.
Okay, so as I mentioned just previously, the federal government, their program alone, it costs about $350 to reduce 1 ton of carbon through this incentive program. And if the federal government prices carbon at $50 per ton, well, we're spending $350 in order to save $50.
Yeah.
And I think most people would realize that that's not a very good deal.
So now the other part of your argument has been that this subsidy for electric vehicles basically favors people who already have means. So I guess my question to you is, who is buying electric vehicles in Canada, who's benefiting from the subsidy?
Yeah, that's a good question. Primarily, it's middle to upper income households that are purchasing the electric vehicles, and we're not talking necessarily the fancy Teslas either. Mm-hmm. There was one survey done, I believe it was an American survey, but I think we found similar results in Canada, that somebody a household who purchased a Ford Focus electric vehicle, their average household income was about $200,000. Mm. So we're not talking the fancy electric vehicles here, but right. They are expensive. They cost anywhere between $12,000 to $25,000 more compared to the equivalent gas-powered vehicle.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's move. We've kind of described what government intervention in the marketplace is doing and who's benefiting, and I get that, and what the cost of that is. So I guess the question is, in contrast, how should the marketplace react to greater demand for electric vehicles? And take us through that journey a little bit.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think that there's a good case to be made that we should let the marketplace do its thing. And there's a couple reasons behind this. First of all, the manufacturers are starting to scale up production. So they're going to be getting additional scale economies that lowers the cost of the EVs. They're also introducing new technologies to lower the cost of the EVs. So there's two elements there that are going to make EVs more widely available. But we can even add to that. Electric vehicles, they have fewer moving parts, and therefore they have lower maintenance costs over their lives. And the fuel costs are, generally much, much lower than combustion engines. And then finally, electric vehicles have higher rates of depreciation. Mm-hmm. So if we put all those together, it will not be long before we achieve cost parity between an electric vehicle and a regular internal combustion engine vehicle.
How far away are we from that now, do you think?
Well, this is an estimate, but from what we see, it's anywhere between 2025 to 2030 that the rough cost parity could be reached, and at that point, it can become quite cost effective for lower medium households to purchase an EV, especially if it was for a second car.
I see what you're saying. So that could be a bit of a tipping point for households of lesser means to get into the market.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we can also make a case for the charging station and the infrastructure around that. Let's keep in mind that when cars were introduced way back when, there were no gas stations around. Well, the market reacted and it developed a whole network of gas stations to to fuel the vehicles. And we see that happening right now. We see Tesla's got a huge, very significant network of charging stations, and GM, Mercedes, Volkswagen, BMW, they're all investing in charging stations. So the market is reacting. So money that the government's giving to subsidize charging stations is also quite questionable, especially when companies, for-profit corporations, are eligible for these subsidies. It's great that companies want to add charging stations to their buildings.
Right.
I encourage them to do that. I'm just not quite sure why taxpayers have to foot a part of the bill.
Gotcha. Well, we're going to continue our discussion with Jerome Gessaroli. He is a visiting fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa, talking all things electric vehicles and the subsidies that go along with that. We'll continue our discussion after this break. Please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Jerome Gessaroli, talking about electric vehicles and those subsidies. Jerome, you also write that society can do some other things other than these expensive electric vehicle subsidies that are cheaper to abate carbon emissions, which could have an equal or a better effect. So can you take us through that a little bit?
Sure, Tony. When I originally looked at doing this paper up, there's some pretty dire forecasts with regard to global emissions and the effect it'll have on our climate. So what I wanted to see is that whatever we're going to be doing, it better be, we better be getting the most bang for our buck, having the greatest effect, the impact on the dollars we're spending for this. So we found that it's very, very expensive, not great policy for these EV subsidies. And I looked at I surveyed a few other different alternatives, a way of reducing carbon emissions. And there are a number of them that are significantly cheaper.
Okay.
So for instance, methane gas. Methane gas is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's quite bad. And we have some emission regulations governing methane gas emissions. But if we could develop a more comprehensive guidelines and rules with regard to that gas and controlling the amount that we emit, that'll have a significant impact. And that they estimate to be about $20 per ton in cost to develop that type of regulatory framework.
And we don't really have that now, where, as you say, there is some regulatory work that's been done on methane, but you're saying we should put more of our shoulder into that? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, we definitely do have some, and we are working on it. But there can be a fair bit more done on identifying the emissions and how to mitigate them, etc. And when we talk about $20 per ton of cost for doing that, compared to the federal government's $350 per ton, $350 per ton cost using the EV program, well, it's much more cost effective with the other alternative.
Do you think that Canada's carbon emission reduction goals can be met without these EV subsidies then?
I believe if we properly identify areas that give us greater bang for our investment dollar that we put into these, we can come close to meeting our targets.
Okay.
But the problem is when the politics get confused with the policy.
Okay, can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, sure. I mean, who doesn't like to receive money for the government to buy a vehicle, to buy a car?
Right.
So I could imagine that, sure, absolutely, people will generally like that, and politicians will generally think, yeah, that's a great policy from our point of view. But we're certainly not getting the results that we could be getting with the money we're spending.
It would be interesting to know with these consumers who do buy the electric vehicles, just how important the subsidy is for them, or whether they would just be buying the car in any case, that they've made a decision, they just use the car for city driving, they're not doing long hauls with a car. So, it's getting from point A to point B within a large city like Toronto. Do you think, is there any data on that you know of?
Well, I haven't seen any for Canada, but it's an interesting point you bring up. In Norway, where they've got the world's largest adoption, given their population of electric vehicles, we're finding that they are using them for only very specific reasons, and they keep, and it's usually a second vehicle, and they keep their regular gas-powered car for a lot of the major driving. So yeah, there is some of that kind of thinking that goes on
Right.
with people buying the cars.
Yeah, well, and one would expect that in Canadian winters, the non-electric vehicle, the gas-powered vehicle, might be more deployed, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Unfortunately, the electric vehicles, their performance and range is substantially reduced in cold climates. And hopefully, in the next few years, there'll be some technologies that mitigate that improve that. But that is the case right now.
We're going to continue with our guest right after this break. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here with Jerome Gessaroli. He is a visiting fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, talking about electric vehicles, subsidies, and climate change, all of those things. Jerome, I'd be remiss in my job if I didn't ask, since we have you on the program, how does your sort of views on electric vehicle subsidies, how does that connect with any views you may or may not have about carbon taxes as a method to generate the appropriate behavior from consumers and so on?
Yeah, the carbon tax, if it's properly set up and managed, it can be an effective mechanism for incenting people to look for non-carbon emitting alternatives. So it can be good. But again, I mean, it's good that you raised this question, because when we've introduced our carbon tax, and then on top of that, we're introducing these other type of subsidies, then it confuses, it undercuts the actual intent of the carbon tax. So, if we believe carbon tax is the way to go, which the federal government, claims that it is definitely the way to go, then let the carbon tax provide the incentives for individuals to change their purchasing and their carbon emitting behavior.
So are you saying that a combination of the two is, because obviously the carbon tax is a hit on the consumer, anybody who's gassing up their vehicle, versus the other, which is a subsidy, so it's a benefit. So just walk me through again why you think that may be bad public policy.
Well, the carbon tax, as I said, it will provide an incentive for individuals to change their behavior. That's the main goal of the tax. And the subsidies it doesn't necessarily undercut that, but it doesn't really allow the tax to do its thing.
Right, I see.
Yeah. So the policy, it overlaps and it gets confusing, and we're not seeing the results for the money we're spending.
Yeah, I think that's, I understand your point now, because really, when you look at the subsidies, it's now going to be over $400 million. That was before the budget. Are we getting is that something that government can say, because we did this, they can draw a line from that to vehicles being purchased and the reduction in emissions? But because you can't really say that, that really is the heart of your concern about this particular policy.
Yeah, we'll really have, it'll be very difficult to separate the cause and effect and the degree of each because of these commingling effects.
Anybody else in the world doing the subsidies the way Canada's doing it?
Oh, definitely. These are again, they're quite widespread. They're popular politically. They're popular. However, there are countries actually starting to get away from them. I believe China had some fairly generous incentives, but they're backing away from them. And my understanding, there's a few governments in Europe even that might be backing away from them now. And not all provinces in Canada either are offering these subsidies,
Right.
and for good reason, because the energy that's used to produce the electricity, if it's fossil fuel based, then the electric vehicles will still contribute towards
Right.
carbon.
Yeah, so, and that's the other side of the calculation, right? That the electricity has to be clean electricity.
Oh, it has to be. So Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, they don't, they rely, well, not so much Manitoba, but the other provinces do rely more on fossil fuels for generating their electricity. And so it is appropriate, especially appropriate if they don't offer subsidies for EV purchases.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it at that. Jerome Gessaroli, thank you for joining me today. Very interesting discussion about electric vehicles and the subsidies, and I hope you keep writing about it. It's a very interesting topic.
Well, thank you for having me on your show. I appreciate it, Tony.
For sure. Would like to thank Jerome Gessaroli again for joining me today, talking about vehicle subsidies for electric vehicles and the emissions. Maybe there's a better way to do it. Thanks for watching.